this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Request, we will focus on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy today. We found that the program delivered support to employers in sectors most impacted by the pandemic. However, we could not assess the impact of the program, including whether objectives were met, because employers were required to provide only limited self-declared information in their applications. To carry out our audit work, we used GST HST returns because it was the best information that was available. The agency did not have monthly revenue data for businesses, even though this information is critical based on eligibility criteria for the benefit. By analyzing the GST HST returns filed with the Canada Revenue Agency in 2020 and 2021, we estimated that $15.5 billion in benefits were paid to recipients of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy who might not have been eligible to receive them. We concluded that all of those payments should be investigated further. I am concerned about the limited progress in post-payment verification work for all the programs we looked at, including the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. The government knew that significant post-payment work would be needed the moment the decision was made to limit prepayment controls. However, neither resources nor plans have been sufficiently adjusted to reflect the unprecedented circumstances brought on by the pandemic. The federal government has spent billions of dollars and does not know whether that money always went to eligible recipients. In the interest of being fair to all taxpayers, the government must carry out rigorous verification work. If it chooses a different approach, then it must be clear and transparent with Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we're pleased to be here today to discuss Auditor General of Canada's Report 10 on the specific COVID benefits, with a focus today, COVID-19 benefits, the focus today on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, or CEWS, as we may refer to it. This program within constrained timelines in order to meet urgent financial and economic needs. What's more, the CRA itself is not a policy-making body. It administered the CEWS according to the parameters set by the government and as passed by Parliament in enabling legislation. With respect to Report 10, the CRA accepts the majority of the recommendations and partially accepts one and is working to implement them. This is noted in the CRA's action plan, which has been shared with the committee. At the same time, on one point, the CRA did have some observations surrounding the OAG's estimate of potentially ineligible payments that require further investigation into the CEWS, and the Auditor General has referenced that in her remarks. The results of completed CEWS audits to date suggest that the number of ineligible claims is expected to be significantly lower than initially projected by the Auditor General. By way of background, as is usual in compliance work, the CRA has started its reviews and audits of the highest risk claimants, allowing the CRA to focus on claims that are most likely to be ineligible or overstated. This approach optimizes recoveries and ensures that high-risk claims are addressed while making efficient use of CRA resources. It's too early in the compliance cycle of this program to provide concrete numbers on total ineligible claims with a degree of certainty. As noted by the Auditor General, a more definitive estimate of payments to potentially ineligible recipients will only be determined once the comprehensive post-payment audit activities are complete. We will continue to work diligently on its compliance, on our compliance efforts, including addressing the recommendations made by the Auditor General.
Ms. Hogan, you mentioned in your opening statement, you noted your concern on CRA's limited progress in post-payment verification, despite the government knowing the importance of it because of the limited controls. State plans and resources haven't been adjusted to reflect the importance. Now we've looked, it's over $100 billion in CEWS. Some of it went to very wealthy, very profitable foreign companies, foreign-controlled multinationals. Some went to China state-owned companies, China state-owned banks. And as I mentioned, it's $100 billion. Like, what more should the CRA be doing? You mentioned that there's limited progress in the verification. What should they be doing to protect taxpayers?
Well, what we were looking for was that there would have been perhaps an earlier start or more resources devoted to doing more work. Because if we look at a typical program that the government has, and I'll use, for example, the employment insurance program, there's very rigorous vetting of an application before an individual receives benefits. There is still some post-payment work done even after all of that rigorous prepayment verification. In this instance, there was very limited prepayment controls with the intention of doing rigorous post-payment work. In our view, that should be more than you would typically do on a program. Here we identified with the monthly GST filers who received about 64% of the wage subsidy that there were some risks that it required further investigation. And the only way you can find out whether or not a business is eligible would be to do that post-payment work, because there is no other information to verify eligibility.
Mr. Hamilton, considering what the AG has stated, and we've seen, I think in one report, 27 billion, 15 billion, do you not think that is a large enough number to further investigate based on the GST numbers? Like, I'm just aghast. Like, we've all experienced CRA, and let's be honest, Canadians don't view it as a service. We've experienced, as MPs, CRA going after small businesses for tiny amounts. We've seen them go after regular Canadians. Like, this is a huge amount of potential money. Like, who at the CRA is making the decision that, you know, we're willing to risk writing off 15, 20, 25 billion dollars of taxpayers' money?
Mr. Chair, first I would say we are trying to change people's impressions of the CRA as being a bit more service-oriented, but that's a journey. On the issue of would we be worried about it? I think we are doing the work that's necessary to uncover where there are risks and where there is money
what if you're
that went
wrong?
to ineligible people.
But what if you're wrong?
And I maybe would ask my colleagues to expand on it, but we have filed a progress report with the committee. We're examining as we go what we see and what does it tell us through our business intelligence and other models,
So
where we need to look next and where we need to look after that.
Let me just interrupt. So you're
and I think that
sorry, let me
I'm
interrupt, Mr.
confident that we're
Hamilton.
gonna,
Just the CRA's position then, it's comfortable dismissing, for lack of better, politer words, the AG's concerns about, you know, 15, 20 billion dollars of money that should be clawed back for taxpayers.
Mr. Chair, I wouldn't interpret it that way at all. I think we're actually moving towards the same goal. We both want to have effective compliance to ensure that Canadians have a fair tax system or benefit system at their disposal. I think that where we might differ is how valuable is that monthly GST data, and then going to the 15.5 in determining our
Thanks,
compliance
Mr. Hamilton.
efforts.
Who decided to set it up as an attestation for this use? Was that finance? Who made the final decision? And it can't be a group decision. It's someone would have to make the decision. You mentioned earlier that I think you would have liked a bit stronger controls. Who made the final decision to set it up as it was?
Well, I think it was the government's decision, and was set out, in the
Did
legislation
the
that was set
CRA
forward.
put forward recommendations of a different way to set up stronger fencing around it to protect Canadian taxpayers?
Mr. Chair, we would have identified...
CRA was part of the consultation. Did you recommend stronger fencing?
Here, Mr. McCauley, why don't we allow him to answer because the time's almost done. Go ahead, Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, we were definitely part of the conversations around that. I'm not going to talk about who said what and who didn't say what in that conversation, but
I think it's
the
important.
risks
Did the
were...
CRA recommend stronger
Mr. McCauley,
fencing?
I'd like to, your time is done, so you can come back. You have another round.
Whose final decision will it be then to pursue the path that you've stated you're taking on the audits? Is that CRA decision?
The decision to, excuse me, Mr. Chair, the decision to carry on with the plan that we have.
As opposed to what the AG has recommended? Is that purely the CRA's decision?
I would say it's largely the CRA's decision. I suppose somebody else within government could come to a different view and tell us not to do anything. But I think in this domain, we largely decide.
At any point during the program, did the CRA, because there were updates to how the program was extended, changed, did the CRA come back then and say, okay, we've had time, it's been 2 months in, 3 months in, let's seriously up the fencing for the wage subsidy?
Mr. Chair, I don't recall us doing that with the wage subsidy, I'll have to say, because, again, we felt relatively comfortable that, given the circumstances, we had some prepayment checks that were kicking out a lot of claims before we made the payments. So we felt that we had a pretty good system in place. It wasn't done, if I contrast it with the CERB, where we had less prepayment controls. So I don't recall ever saying that. I do recall us, talking about, so how are we going to do the post-payment verifications, and what's going to be the time frame for that, and how do we, as the Auditor General said, if you see areas that need more work, then we will do that work. And how
I don't want to put words in the mouth. It sounds like the CRA's was looking at it and saying, well, this is not an issue. I think I think they're just very low bars to access a subsidy, an attestation program that's not really based on a lot of proof of dropped revenues, et cetera, or, payroll numbers. But so the CRA was just comfortable with that?
Mr. Chair, I would say that there's a lot of space between being comfortable, thinking you have a good plan, and not caring, not worrying about it. So we cared. We worry about this. At the CRA, we have the dual responsibility to not only deliver benefits, but a big responsibility to enforce compliance so that it's a fair tax system.
Is there any discussion about using SIN numbers, as been suggested by the AG? Like, is there a chance that perhaps, like we've seen, state-owned China state-owned companies receiving a subsidy, could we have been giving money to subsidies to non-Canadians on payrolls? We saw other issues of dead people receiving CERB, people outside the country. Is that an opportunity? Like, why didn't we use this social insurance numbers?
Mr. Chair, at the beginning, we thought about whether we could use the social insurance numbers. A few problems with that, and the reasons why we didn't. It would have taken a lot longer to develop, do the systems development that we would have needed to do to incorporate those. It would have had a burden on employers to provide those. And so we didn't do it out of the get because it was going to take too long and it was going to delay the program. And then you also have to recognize, once you have a program in place, to come in with different measures can be complicating at that stage. So even if you thought you might want to do something, it's once you've got it in place and it's running, and if you're largely comfortable that you'll be able to deal with it.
There was a fair amount of subsidies to companies that ended up insolvent, but were long in arrears of HST, GST remittances or other remittances to the government. Was there discussion or red flags raised by the CRA, knowing these are strong indicators of eventual insolvency, that we're subsidizing people who owe the government significant amounts of money?
Mr. Chair, well, we certainly take account of what we observe and factor that in. So, where's the risk? Would that company be a particularly high risk? Potentially. But I do want to make sure that we don't confuse administrative issues with policy issues, because you can get both in here of people that might think from a policy perspective a company should not have been eligible. We administer the legislation as it's drafted, and it's permitted.
I realize that you're implementing the policy. Did you recommend to the policymakers, we shouldn't extend the subsidy to companies that look like they are in insolvency? I think it was AG report, it was $4 billion as of last year was owed by subsidy recipients to the government of Canada, but it still had subsidies. Like, was the recommendation when this program was being developed, hey, no, let's not subsidize companies that owe the government billions of dollars? And therefore,
I'm going to cut it off there. Mr. McCall, you have another round and you can come back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, how rare is it that a department does not fully accept Auditor General's finding?
I guess on paper, most departments usually say agreed. In reality, I don't know. So
I know there's a back
couldn't
and forth.
estimate.
There's a draft report and there's a
absolutely a
discussion.
back and forth, and we agree that the recommendation is one that can be implemented, and so on and so forth. And I think the concern here is we don't take issue with the risk-based approach that the department's made. It's really the amount of work, the extent of work, that we don't believe is sufficient in order to meet sort of that fairness threshold of treating every taxpayer, whether they be an individual or business, fairly. If you've identified a potential 100,000 businesses that are not complying, to only look at a fraction of those is not treating every taxpayer fairly. The first step is to identify payments to ineligible recipients. Then the decision can be made to go after collection or not collection. There can be all kinds of choices made for compassionate reasons and so on. But I just encourage the government to be a lot more transparent with what they're doing, and I think they need to do more work.